Canada's federal prison system is in crisis. That's the claim of journalist Michael Harris. In a controversial new book, he says that the prisons are being run, in effect, by the inmates. He also claims that serious offenders are being released sooner than ever, putting the public at risk. The book is called Con Game: The Truth About Canada's Prisons. You've traveled into the heart of the Canadian prison system to give us a picture of life there. But before I get into that, I want to talk about something I think that causes the public the greatest amount of concern, which is prisoners who are released and commit new crimes. You make the point in this book that we have been given, over time, a patently false picture of recidivism. Tell me about that.
Well, the picture is totally false. Recidivism, as a normal person would understand it, is anyone who reoffends. If you can believe it, the federal government is now saying it has no recidivism statistics. None. It does not know.
Doesn't keep them.
Doesn't keep them, and it's unknowable, and it's undoable. And the reason that they give is false, but here it is. They say that because several levels of jurisdictions are involved, it would take a constitutional amendment to be able to track and link provincial criminals with federal criminals, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it's totally false. All they need to do is plug into CPIC, and then they would know. And it took me about a year to find out the real figure, and when I found it out, it was 400% higher than the number that was given by
Well, let's talk about that, because when they were talking about the figures, they were talking about 10, 11% of repeat offenders, of those who are on parole or out on statutory release. You come up with a number about 44%.
Yeah.
Explain the difference.
Well, Dr. Joel Ginsberg of CSC came up with the number. He did it in a public debate with me in front of a law class in high school outside of Ottawa. And he put a pie chart on the wall that said 43% of our customers are recidivists and 57% are new customers. I never got that number out of CSC, and in fact the Justice Committee didn't either, neither did the Canadian people. Commissioner Ingstrup said, "It is our joy we've got the number down to 10 or 11% for recidivism."
You've also come up with some pretty shocking statistics about the actual number of murders that are committed by prisoners who have been released.
367 Canadians have been murdered by people on parole in the system, not all killers, other people who've done other crimes, over a 24-year period. And I guess the shocking thing to me as a researcher and a writer is I've sat in on the debates on capital punishment, where those handful of cases, one of which I've written about, Donald Marshall, are constantly used as a good reason why not to have capital punishment. And it is a good argument. These guys might have been executed, and we're worried about one person getting executed. And so we did away with capital punishment so that could never happen. We have 367 people over a 24-year period being killed by people on parole, and nothing happens to the parole system. It's not even mentioned. In fact, what they say is, you know, nobody's perfect. You can't have zero tolerance hysteria leading the debate.
The theory of parole, of course, is that you have to have some accounting for good behavior, and you have to provide an incentive for good behavior. What's breaking down? What isn't working there?
There is no good behavior in the federal penitentiary system because right off the top, stat release is the law. 1/3 of the sentence is automatically discounted, which means that you can act out, do whatever you want. In fact, I've interviewed people in the book who said when they first went in, they didn't care what they did because they knew their stat release date was written in stone. They were getting out
1/3 of their time.
2/3.
By and large, they're going to
2/3 of their time.
Right.
The last 1/3 is automatically discounted. But the fact also is, it's even worse than that. The average amount of time a Canadian federal inmate does before he gets his day parole is 32% of his sentence, 38% for full parole. And what we really have is a money-saving system that hides behind the notion that they're correcting criminal behavior when in fact what they're doing is saving the costs of incarceration, leading all the way back to 1980 when the federal government decided not to build prisons even though they knew the number of offenders was rising. So the only thing left to them was to funnel and cascade the people in the system through more quickly, and the Canadian people are the losers because the streets have become much more dangerous than they were before.
Let's talk about the cost and how the cost works into parole and when prisoners are getting out and not getting out. My understanding is that it costs about 5 times more to incarcerate a criminal than it is to parole them on the outside. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
And you claim that in fact is what is pushing a lot of the inmates through the system rather than any kind of sense of they are rehabilitated or not rehabilitated.
That's absolutely what is driving the system right now is the financial considerations. It costs roughly $100,000 to keep a federal inmate in maximum security, more for a female, and it costs about $15,000 on the street for a person to get their sentence supervised in the community. And what's happening, of course, is we're having fewer people under lock and key. and for our 50% increase in the CSC budget over a 10-year period, we are getting fewer people locked up and secure, more people on the street who are dangerous. And the statistics are right through the system, Alan. 38% more violence in the medium security penitentiaries because, of course, they're stepping stones to parole. So people in J units in maximum security are being rushed down to medium security so that they can hit the street more quickly, and they're not ready, and what's happening is a lot more violent incidents inside medium security, and that funnels right down to the street. By the time these guys get out, many of them are not ready, and they reoffend. One of the classic examples I document in the book is a guy who actually asked CSC, keep me inside, beyond my stat date. I'm not ready. I know I'll reoffend. Pack your bags was the message. Get out.
Here, though, it seems to is the conundrum for a lot of people. I mean, the average inmate is getting out after, I guess, just a little bit over 1/3 of the sentence.
Correct.
And while they're in there, it's a terrible environment. What's to cause us to believe that if we kept them in longer, that they would behave any better once they got out?
Well, CSC itself did a study in 1997 which showed that people who went out on their stat release reoffended at a percentage of about 15% higher than people who served their full sentence.
So that actually the longer they stayed in, the less likely they were to reoffend.
I'm just quoting their study. All Engstrup did not call a press conference to announce that statistic, but that was true. They have that report. There is absolutely no evidence that putting people back out on the street increases their chance to reintegrate into the community. And in fact, that is why they're fudging the recidivism rates, because the recidivism rates will show that the system, in terms of programming or changing criminal behavior or correcting it, is failing.
I think, though, a lot of the things that really outrages the population is that when crimes are committed when the inmate is on parole. Is the problem that we're letting these people out too early, or is the problem relating to what's happening while they're on parole?
Well, parole is a joke. You've got 80,000 people in Ontario and 900 parole officers. You tell me how successfully they're going to supervise anybody. One of the worst cases is Michael Hector. He was out on parole. He was an armed robber. He killed 3 people during the period of time he was on parole, reporting to his parole officer every week. Supervision in the parole officer, as far as protection of the public goes, is a completely fraudulent claim. It doesn't do anything to protect you. The only thing that's going to protect you is a true rehabilitation, which cannot be programmed from the outside. From the people that I saw and the people I talked to in the system, like Tom Epp, who is Deputy Commissioner of CSC, he said the big mistake we made is we did everything for the prisoner, for the rehabilitation, and demanded nothing from him. And so they get the idea that, you know, we are to blame for what you did, you are a victim, and we're trying to help you be successful. If you compare that to what Ontario has done under former Premier Harris's earned remission legislation, they're returning the onus to the people who should have it. You tell us why we should let you out. And I think that makes a lot of sense to people. You earn your remission, and if you get good behavior, you get out. If you don't wait for some automatic magical date where we let you out because the stat says that. Right.
Now, there is, I understand, even a new accelerated parole period for first-time nonviolent offenders, which is 1/6 of their time.
That's right.
Does that make any sense if you don't have no history of violence, if you're first time?
I guess it's all in the working out. I have sympathy for people who make mistakes, do something that's going to give them 2 years plus a day, and so they go to the federal system, who are not going to be career criminals. And I'd like to think that those people can get a break. But let me tell you about the other side of the coin. How can you define a drug offense, a serious importation offense, as nonviolent, as the courts have recently done? We had a Project Omerta drug investigation, conspiracy investigation in Colombia run by the RCMP. It cost us $10 million. We caught the people. They were connected to the mob. We convicted the people. But because the importation of cocaine was deemed to be nonviolent, and it was a first offense for the people caught, they served 8 months. I asked you, does that strike you as justice, or does that strike you as anything working towards the rehabilitation of a career criminal and a professional criminal, or does it send the message to these people, if you want to do business, hey, they've got accelerated parole review in Canada. If you get caught and it's a first offense, you're laughing.
You spend a lot of time actually inside the system, and you paint what is really a horrifying picture of drug, alcohol abuse, violence, and basically make the claim that the inmates are running the institution. Tell me about that. Tell me what's happening inside the system right now.
Well, the fair way of putting this was best said by Mike Proven, who's the warden of Fenbrook Institution in Ontario, federal pen and the model prison right now. He said, some days I run the prison, and some days the union and the guards run the prison, and some days the prisoners run the prison. What I found was when you went into the higher security level prisons, oddly enough, you found the prisoners were more likely running the institution. And it reached ludicrous levels at Kingston Penitentiary, for example, when in one case the management of the prison actually allowed the prisoners themselves to do a search for contraband after a disturbance. The guards were told not to do it, that the prisoners would handle it. There was a deference to the inmate committees. In the murder of Alfie Martin, people asked a guard to leave the range because something bad was going to happen. And Alfie Martin was murdered that afternoon. Where did these guys get the weapons? How can they all be using as much drugs as they are? How can you be having that much brew in an institution when mixed with drugs that leads to this explosion of violence, as in the Martin case?
Well, let's talk about those because you give us answers to, I mean, drugs.
Yeah. There's no
I mean,
penalty, virtually no penalty inside for using.
But the policy is zero tolerance,
Yeah.
none. Yet you make the point that, at any given day, 90% of prisoners are high by 11 o'clock. Where do the drugs come from?
Okay. 90% of the drugs walk in through the front door of the prison and are passed over in personal and family visits. So the family and correspondence room and the private trailers are usually the transshipment points. The other percentage of drugs come in the back door of the prison. Sometimes it's guards. Sometimes it's people who service the institution. For example, at Fenbrook, they put a Mr. Sub into the institution. And within a month, the manager of the Mr. Sub was charged with drug trafficking because they've got a captive audience and they can command prices that are 300% higher than they are on the street. Mm-hmm. And in the penitentiary system, what we have is people who talk zero tolerance, but then privately say to you, we really need to get these guys bleach kits. We really need a needle exchange.
Which they actually have.
Yes,
in
that's
some
right.
instances, they give bleach kits so that they can sterilize
Yeah.
needles?
So as Shakespeare might put it, such welcome and unwelcome things at once, 'tis hard to reconcile. How can you have zero tolerance and be supplying people bleach kits to use drugs? Nobody will ever say it publicly,
Right.
but they'll say it privately. If we cut off the supply, things get very tense in here. And if you look back to the mid-'70s when we had the policy change from protection of the public to rehabilitation of the inmate, what caused it? We had 60 violent episodes in that year, 75 to 76, which was more than we had in the previous 40 years. Mm-hmm. That's what stampeded Francis Fox, at that time the minister, into having the emergency investigation of the prison system and the overhaul that's given us the system we have today.
Right. A lot of people work on the assumption that once incarcerated, once charged, you lose your rights of citizenship. Where did this notion of prisoners' rights come from, and what extent is it right now?
It's huge. The notion of prisoners' rights, there's always been a kind of, it's always had a kind of cachet amongst liberal thinkers who look back to the excesses of another century, rightfully so, and say that is hideous, we should never treat human beings that way, don't chain people to the floor and feed them off steel plates. I agree with that. But it's gone so far, it is ludicrously beyond any semblance of an issue of rights, and now it's into an issue of we've got the inmates running the asylum. And they will use portions of Supreme Court decisions, as they did in Solotsky, to say that essentially today the situation for a Canadian federal inmate is this. He has every right that you have, except the one thing that was taken from him for his offense, which is his liberty. So now we have a Supreme Court reference again on the issue of voting, for example. We have a special fund set up by the federal government, the Court Challenge Program, which loans money to inmates like Clifford Olson, who's used it 17 times to sue the system. The two people who murdered Alfie Martin in Kingston Penitentiary borrowed $5,000 from the Court Challenge Program to prevent their transfer to the Special Handling Unit in Quebec after they murdered an inmate.
Privacy rights.
Yeah, privacy rights, same thing. You've got a situation where if a guard is stabbed by an inmate, and the guard is suspicious or fearful that the inmate has Hep C or HIV, which in some cases it goes as high as 50 or 60% of the population. I have documented cases where it took 10 months for that guard to find out what the medical record was, going through the swampland of privacy rights. They are paramount.
You have a fair amount of sympathy, obviously, for the men and women who work inside the system. And
worst workplace in the world.
As you say, worst workplace, the worst morale of any public service
right.
in the system. In fact, you call it an unmitigated disaster.
It is. Yeah.
Give us some sense of what their life is like.
Well, I interviewed one female guard, and she, they call their walks whines. And on her whines through the prison, she has to make sure there's a live body breathing in each cell. So she kept coming past this one cell where this man can, persistently was masturbating every time she passed. And she finally said, I'm going to charge you if you keep doing this. She goes back and is told by her manager, maybe he likes you. She is outraged, and another guard goes and deals with the inmate because he feels that their dignity is on the line. On the issue of, for example, I'll give you a good example. A guard 2 weeks ago was at a Tim Hortons shop on his way to work in Kingston. An inmate had told the warden of Kingston Penn that this guard was bringing drugs into the institution. He was dressed in his uniform. He was having a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons. The Penn squad rolled in, arrested him without warrant on the spot, searched him in the parking lot in front of all the customers and his peers, searched his vehicle, and then drove him to the CSC headquarters and strip searched him. And then, when nothing was found, the warden apologized to this particular guard and said that we had no choice once we had the tip from an inmate. And if you reverse the situation and you start talking about if a guard has suspicion that an inmate is dealing drugs, he couldn't get access to his cell without written permission. And if he was a native inmate, he'd have to get his spiritual counselor to agree to be there before he could search. But the guard was taken down publicly without any explanation of what was going on and strip searched.
It's an ugly job, though. And you hear all kinds of stories on the other sides of guards abusing prisoners.
But you know what? The guards abusing prisoners story, again, part of the mythology of the Cool Hand Luke school of thought. The fact of the matter is, prisoners are so litigious these days that if even a third of the stories you heard were true, we'd have half of our prisons emptied of sadistic guards. The fact of the matter is, most guards take daily abuse, Alan, that you would not believe. And they are told it comes with the job, both male and female. And one of the great shortfalls is that not only does it do a disservice to the men and women who put their lives on the line, without weapons in many cases, but it also sends a message to the inmate that it's all right to abuse the symbol of what is the outside authority.
Now, throughout the book, I mean, you're very critical of Canada Corrections Services, in particular the former commissioner, Ole Engstrom, and the whole notion of restorative justice. First, tell us about what that notion is and why you have a problem with it.
It says that every prisoner is capable of rehabilitation, which is a noble premise to start from. I'd like to think that's true. And secondly, it says we will build a system around supplying that person with community standards. He will enjoy inside what everyone else enjoys outside in order to rehabilitate him and make him fit to be a citizen when he gets out. The reason I have a problem with it, it has been to the exclusion of any notion that the persons who get in there are in there for, it's not finishing school, they're there for having violated our most serious statutes. And there is a degree of the covenant with the victim that I think is totally missing. I think that in the ideal world it should be a triumvirate of we keep that covenant with the victim by expressing the view that we reserve the right to punish you if you kill somebody or you harm somebody seriously. I think programs are essential, but they have to be measurable. And right now there's no measurement going on. We don't know the recidivism rate, so how could we measure anything? And thirdly, there is the prisoner himself. And I think that while it's wonderful to have this notion that he can be, restorative justice is better than retributive justice, that says that the burden is on who? Us? Well, yes, partially to give him the programs, but also on him. And what Mr. Engstrom has done is give us a system where there's no burden on the prisoner whatsoever. The total burden, as Tom Epp put it to me, is placed on the system.
Much of the way our federal prison system works is modeled on Denmark. And you say this is a completely wrong model for us to be using. Why?
Well, first of all, Denmark has 5 million people, very homogeneous population, very, very stable, low crime rate, and 20% of the crime in Denmark is bicycle theft. So you're dealing with a very different person. Most of the people in Danish prisons are drug addicts. We have a violent prisoner profile in Canada, with 80% of the people in our federal system there for violent offenses. So we overlay the Danish kinder and gentler system over a North American crime scene, and you get people who just basically think the system is weak and will take advantage of it.
Right. Well, but nothing seems to be working in the United States either, where you have both the highest incarceration rate and the highest crime rate.
No. For the last 10 years, the crime rate in the United States has been at its lowest level, and their incarceration rate is at 735 per 100,000. Very, very high. But just recently, the chief of police of Charleston, South Carolina, Reuben Greenberg, whose book, Taking Back the Streets, has been a bestseller in the United States, has pointed out that, yes, they have a high incarceration rate, over 700 people per 100,000, compared to our 118. But Americans have never been safer. But part of the mythology of the United States is the big, bad criminal justice system. You incarcerate and you still have the highest crime rates. It's not so. It's rather like the gun debate. University of Chicago professor says more guns, more safety. and he's a big liberal, and then when you do the statistical breakdown, that's what the reality is. So the American system, which is always vilified, is often vilified the same way guards are. It's part of the mythology. They are a high crime society, a drive-by shooting society. But in fact, for the last 10 years, their crime rates have been dropping.
You tell stories which, again, are going to outrage a lot of people about what life is like inside prisons, where prisoners get cable TV, that they're allowed, you know, lots of possessions. They go into solitary confinement, and they take their TVs with them. But the theory here, again, is that, you know, incarceration unto itself, the loss of freedom, you know, is so dignity-robbing that you have to allow people to have, you know, some kind of amenities that are comparable to the outside. Is that helping or hurting behavior in the prison system?
It leads to a sense of entitlement. I mean, nobody's talking about bringing back the lash and you know, feeding people bread and water, but there's a big difference. If you go to a place like William Head, for example, in the federal system.
This in B.C.
Yeah, in Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where it's got a high population of killers and convicted murderers in it. It's classified as a medium island, but when I went there, I literally thought I had gone to the wrong place. And there was a resort beside the prison on the Straits of Juan de Fuca. Inside the prison, we have a tennis court, we have a salmon fishing wharf, we have a chipping green, and we have a condo complex, to which the inmates have their own keys. And we have a person who's dispatched to Vancouver to buy the food that they choose, that they would like to cook. And to a lot of people sitting outside looking at street people who have done nothing except not have any money, we treat people who have really hurt society much, much better than we treat those people. So it's a question of how much amenities. Do we give them humane treatment? Obviously. Do we go beyond humane treatment and reward good behavior with shorter sentences? Obviously. But do we make prison what they are trying to make prison in a place like Fenbrook, which is the new state-of-the-art federal penitentiary, which is a place that, for most people who are in there, is a step up? I don't think so. And I think that's what Ontario has basically said, is we want prisons to correct criminal behavior. That's their #1 job. We want to make them places that nobody wants to call home while being humane. The cozier you make it, the harder it gets to put any kind of deterrent value on incarceration, to the point where when you get into certain sectors of our criminal groups of people, you have no fear at all of what's going to happen, especially if, say, you are a Native person and you kill your husband, you will end up in a Native healing circle, which is like a resort, and never do a day in jail for it.
Well, let's talk about that, because a court decision basically set out that Aboriginal people should be treated differently by the criminal justice system. Again, you're very critical of that. So basically we've set up almost 2 systems of justice.
Really 3. A 3-tier system that's race-based, gender-based. I think it's a huge mistake to have a kind of affirmative action in the criminal code, so that you say we've got Natives as 2% of the population, they're 15% of the prison population, therefore let's fix it up. Let's tell judges when they're sentencing Natives to reflect their nativeness. Even when the crime, say, is conviction for murder, and the sentence for a white male would be prison, it often isn't for Natives. And I think that's dead wrong, as I think it is for women, to get a different sentence.
Part of that argument is that Aboriginal people have a different justice system within their culture, different value systems, and that should be reflected in the national criminal justice system. You don't buy that either.
I'll tell you what, if you go ask the victims in the Native communities who see the killer of their husband, wife, son, or daughter go to, in effect, a Native healing center and do no time, they think it degrades them. They're saying, oh, if he killed a white person, he'd be in Kingston Penitentiary doing 25 years. And one of our people does it, and you let him go into a camp setting for 2 or 3 years, or even less. There have been cases I documented in the book where people got less than a year for manslaughter in one of these healing centers.
The notion of doing hard time, I mean, Ontario did set up boot camps, but I understand that they're so-called graduates. They have a 40% return rate themselves. I mean, what does that tell you? Is that approach, doing hard time, is that going to produce better results?
When I did my research on the province of Ontario, I was told by the minister that the recidivism rate when they took office was 70%. I am told now that with Project Turnabout, they have reduced it to around the number you gave. So it's a bad number, but it's a better number than a terrible number of 70%. And I guess what it comes down to is you have to face the fact that you're going to have people who return and return to the system. You're not going to be able to turn around people's lives. But what I think we have done in the jail systems in both places until very recently is said the prisoner is everything in terms of the programming. And what that's led us to believe is what the prisoner does really determines for us if it's successful or not. We have totally forgotten the covenant with the public. And that's why the public is looking at the criminal justice system, particularly the correctional service and the parole boards, and saying, you are working against us, not for us, because all you care about is the prisoner.
This notion that prisoners are inmates, criminals, are victims of society. You do offer evidence in the book that without question that people who find their way into the federal prison system disproportionately come from dysfunctional families, poverty, drug use. There is a race-based. I mean, how do we find this balance between, what is society's responsibility for the problems we have as a society, and what are the responsibilities of those who find themselves on the wrong side of the law?
The army of social workers could never be convened that we would need to make the changes. Obviously, the time to intervene isn't after someone ends up at Dorchester Penitentiary. The time to intervene is to take kids and put them in an environment that is better for them, that works for them, where they're not around alcoholic parents or a dysfunctional situation, where they're not being exposed to abuse. All of those things that society has placed so little value on. The early intervention, to me, is a much smarter way to spend the money than to act as if on the other end of the thing you're going to make serious change in people. I don't believe you are. And the recidivism rates back me up. We're not making any inroads in reducing the number of recidivists.